Right now we have our candidate for congressman, and we'll give you 2 minutes for introductions, and then we will start our questions.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for including me. I'm told this is the first time this type of forum has taken place. And I think it's so important, and I'm honored to be part of it. Now, don't take it personally that my name is Robert Zimmerman. I'm the Democratic nominee for Congress in our congressional district. And this is a district that I've lived in since I was 9 years old. I went to our public schools. I worked for members of Congress who represented this district. When I was a kid, I worked for Congressman Lester Wolf. I was an intern for him, became a senior member of the staff. Then I worked with Congressman Jim Shorter. Later, Gary Ackerman got me for free because I was building my business at the time. My firm is now in its 33rd year. I'm a small business owner. And in addition to which, I've also served on the Democratic National Committee. So I've had the opportunity and experience of working both congressional level issues, national issues, and certainly working locally in our communities. And I think that's very important because, especially this type of, in this election, which is so defining about addressing the challenges and hoping to find new opportunities as we deal with emerging from the COVID pandemic, as businesses try to rebuild, families try to reemerge from the pandemic, as we address so many issues that are confronting our communities. And what I find in my experience is we have a lot more in common that unite us, and they're critical to us as we move forward. Now, regrettably, my opponent, George Santos, has not shown up. But don't take it personally, because quite frankly, after I debated him twice, a couple of times, he canceled on appearing in all other debates. He's canceled on most community forums that I can think of, and won't even appear in front of editorial boards to talk about where he stands on the issues. And I think when we talk about what the defining issues are in this campaign, issues that have been part of my life through my work with Congresswoman Grace May and Councilmember Sandra Ung and Linda Lee, what we can do to make sure your community is feeling safe and secure, feeling they have economic opportunity, and they're represented properly in Congress. These are issues I want to address during the questions. But that is the challenge before us. And I've worked locally in Nassau County, organizing, participating in rallies against Asian hate, advocating for legislation that would teach history in our communities, in our school districts. Because once you begin to teach the history of the Muslim community, the contributions of the Indian and Pakistani community, the contributions of certainly our Chinese and Korean community, we cease to create divisions. We realize you realize that we're not the other, but we appreciate all that they contribute, all that they bring to our society and our culture. In the same way, when it comes to addressing hate crimes and hate speech, let's be very clear. It's very easy for politicians to come before you, very easy for politicians to come before you and condemn it. But I have to ask you, when are they prepared to speak up when it's politically difficult? I've not heard one Republican candidate for Assembly or for Congress, or any Republican candidate at all, condemn the vile, hateful rhetoric of the Republican candidate for the state assembly. My opponent, George Santos, has never criticized Donald Trump, ever, for his anti-Muslim rhetoric, his advocacy in support of the Muslim ban, or his hateful rhetoric against the Chinese and Korean community. So political leadership means standing up when it's tough, not just giving you what you want to hear, but taking on sometimes your own community, your own party. That's what it means to stand up for equal opportunity and for justice.
Okay, so we will follow the same format where I will ask a question, you will have 2 minutes, and then Tinsel will give you 30 seconds.
I'll be better on the time.
Okay, so Asian Americans are among the fastest growing minority populations in this region. According to the most recent census data, the town of North Hempstead in particular saw a 62% increase in the Asian American population over the last decade. With Asian Americans as such a large and growing part of the regional population, can you discuss your relationships and support of the AAPI community throughout your career?
Actually, it's been part of my life. I was the past president of Great Neck B'nai B'rith and president of American Jewish Congress. And I found many of the problems you confront were issues that were confronted by the Jewish community. So I'm very proud of the fact that I have worked with the AAPI community, the Muslim community, and with Indian and Pakistani representatives who live here. I've worked on many issues dealing with hate crimes, for example, dealing with discrimination, one of the principal ways we address it, if I may address that for a moment, is one, we've got to make sure that our police are fully funded and properly trained to address the hate crimes that confront our communities throughout this congressional district. It's long overdue. The Department of Justice has got to start tracking these hate crimes too, because when one community is impacted, all the others are as well. These are issues I'm going to make an important priority in my work in Congress. And also, I must say, it's very important that the congressperson's office look like the district it represents. I want to be certain that in my office, I'm going to have representatives serving on my staff who reflect our communities here. That's essential, and it's not happening nearly enough. So here in my office, you're going to find members of the Indian and Pakistani community, representatives of the Chinese and Korean community, other communities. Because when people come into their office, in a congressional office, they come there with a problem. They have to feel welcome. They've got to feel supported. So I think that's going to be very, very critical to address as well.
Crime has become a primary concern of residents. Specific to Asian and Asian Americans, the pandemic brought with it an increase nationwide in anti-Asian harassment and violent crime. How would you plan to combat crime, and specifically, how would you address racially motivated hate crimes?
Well, it begins with speech, how we address each other. What we allow is acceptable in our public discourse. Because hate speech leads to hate crimes. Let's be clear about that. And that's why I bring up the fact that it is appalling that my opponent in this election has not condemned the hate speech from the Republican candidate for the Assembly. It's inexcusable. But he won't do it because of Republican politics, and when he doesn't want to take a risk. Well, that's the job. When I see bigotry exhibited by Democrats, I have no problem calling them out and have a record of doing so. Likewise, when Donald Trump engaged in the most vile, divisive rhetoric against the Muslim community, if you remember the Muslim ban, let's not forget what that was as a symbol. Or his rhetoric against the Chinese and Korean community. Once again, my opponent only stayed silent. My opponent, George Santos, advocated Donald Trump coming back and running for another term of office. In fact, at one point, and you can look it up, George Santos actually advocated stopping legal immigration. Didn't talk about illegal, he said stopping legal immigration for a period of time. So, the way you address the hate crimes and the violence we're seeing is first, by standing up to hate speech. Secondly, as I mentioned before, it's making sure our police are properly funded and supported. I've been endorsed for Congress by former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. He's one of the defining law enforcement leaders in the nation. He supported me because I've stood up, first of all, taking on the bail reform issues that I thought the state handled poorly and terribly. I'm very much for very aggressive fixes and very dramatic changes in the bail reform, rolling back many of the initiatives they put in place. Didn't make my party too happy when I said that, but people committing hate crimes should not get an appearance ticket in the state of New York. They should face the full penalties of the law. And judges should be given more authority and discretion to address the issue. That's one step. Secondly, we have to make sure, as I mentioned before, the Department of Justice has a leadership role to play here in monitoring hate crimes and tracking them. Police have to be supported in doing so. Let me be also clear about something else. We have to do everything we can to put an end to the gun violence, and the pandemic of gun violence in our communities. No teenager should be allowed to buy an assault weapon. We should not be allowing, we shouldn't have to worry about your children going to school and fearing for their safety, or you going shopping or to a place of worship. Let's not kid ourselves. We understand that mosques and synagogues and churches are facing more threats than ever before. So that's why I support, and I worked with Congresswoman Grace Meng on this, getting more federal funds for security for our houses of worship. And that's actually building and we're making progress there. We've got to put an end to gun violence, not taking away guns from people who want them for home safety or for sports activities, making sure that we have ban on assault weapons. We have red flag laws in place. We have stronger background checks. You shouldn't be able to evade background checks by buying a gun at a gun show. It's just unacceptable. That's one issue. One more issue separates me from my opponent, George Santos. He has said publicly he doesn't believe any need for new gun legislation, gun safety legislation. How much over was I? 15. All right, okay, I owe you 15 seconds, folks. You kind of screwed up. Okay, sorry.
A recent topic being discussed nationwide is the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade. What is your stance on the Supreme Court's decision, and how do you believe it should factor into New York's approach on this?
You know, this is a very important issue to address for a moment. I am very proudly and publicly a proud advocate of reproductive freedom for women. Making sure they are entitled, if they choose to, have a safe and legal abortion. The idea that the Supreme Court, in an extremist decision, overturned 50 years of settled law, 50 years of law, to take away a woman's right over her own autonomy, her own health decisions, I think is reprehensible. So I would, as a member of Congress, vote to codify Roe v. Wade, to protect a woman's right to have her own make her own choices about her reproductive future, give her reproductive freedom, and give her own personal choices over her autonomy. I would also pass the Women's Health Protection Act. And once again, this is where my opponent and I differ. My opponent in this race, George Santos, has actually advocated, and it's well documented, he's very proud of it, a national ban on abortion, with no exceptions. He even said women would use rape as an excuse to get an abortion. And he wants to prosecute doctors who provide abortion services. That kind of extremism just has no place in our public discourse. And it really is, it's wrong, and frankly, politicians should not be in the doctor's office with women when they have to make those serious decisions. Those are decisions they have to make personally with their doctors, with their family members, and the religious leaders if they choose to. But it's not up to politicians to tell women about decisions they have to dictate to women their decisions regarding their reproductive health.
So we are all feeling the rising cost of goods, cost of housing and taxes. Many residents of New York, particularly younger adults, are finding it difficult to establish their lives here and may end up having to leave the state. How would you help to address the high cost of living here in New York State to ensure we retain our residents?
It begins first and foremost with bringing back the state and local tax deduction, restoring the SALT tax. That is literally the oldest tax in the history of our federal government. People buy their homes depending upon that state and local tax deduction. And it was taken away nothing more than a political hit job, a political attack from the previous administration to their adversaries politically. It's unacceptable. That has got to be a priority, and I can give you my pledge. I will not vote for any new tax policy from the Biden administration that has not fully restored state and local tax deductions. Secondly, when it comes to young people, we've got to make sure they have job opportunities here, housing opportunities here. That's why I support having free community colleges and trade schools for them, so they can they can move into the workforce with job training skills. And frankly, workforce housing is essential. It has to be decided by the local governments as to how it should be developed. But frankly, I meet so many young people, and frankly, so many older people who want to live in the communities they grew up in, or the communities that have been part of their lives. But because housing is so expensive, we're losing a whole generation of young people who can't afford to be here. So having what's called workforce housing, by investing in the community block grant programs or the home investment programs, is important. I would certainly be a strong advocate for that as well. And this is a real issue we have to focus on. We are losing young people who work in our communities, participate in our stores, shop in our communities, because they can't afford to be here. So bringing them in, and that means teachers, it means school administrators, it means police officers, firefighters. They should be able to work here, especially if they're playing such an important service in our lives.
Our last question is about flooding. With the record rainfall and flooding in our communities, which has led to much property damage. If elected, what can you do to help property owners minimize their damages and improve the infrastructure to prevent these floods?
Well, first we have to recognize that we have a climate crisis. We've got to respect the fact, we've got to respect science. Now that shouldn't be a very novel idea. It shouldn't be a very innovative thought, but in my campaign for Congress, I feel like I'm debating my opponent even though he's not here. Because frankly, one of the reasons he doesn't show up at these forums is that he can't defend the fact that he refuses to recognize there's a climate crisis. I've asked him that many times in multiple debates. We've had a couple of them. Each time he's refused to answer the question of whether we have a climate crisis. The severe weather we are having, and this is a very personal issue to me as a small business owner, and many of you as homeowners. The severe weather situations we have that are happening on an increasing frequency are destroying businesses, people's homes, their net worth, and in fact, in the borough of Queens, 11 people died living in basement apartments because of flooding. It's unacceptable. So how do we address it? First, I'm a strong advocate of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was just passed by Congress. That's essential. Now, my opponent, Mr. Santos, disagrees with me on this. He doesn't support the bill. He said there are things about the bill he doesn't like. Well, frankly, there's no such thing as a perfect piece of legislation, trust me. But yes, sometimes you got to make those tough compromises if you want to be serious about legislating. That's just the deal. And so, yes, I want to make sure we have funding to repair our roads, improve our sewer systems, make sure our sewage treatment plants are retrofitted so they can handle more capacity and not spew nitrogen in Long Island Sound and contaminate the sound. We survive off of our groundwater. We live above an aquifer. That's where our drinking water comes from. We've got to be able to use that infrastructure fund to clean up contaminated plumes. And in fact, that's essential. This is where the money would go from an infrastructure bill. Protecting our property values, protecting our water supply, our health. That's why it's so essential. And we have to take these steps to deal with increasing change of climate. Furthermore, one last thought. While we can't, of course, shut off the switch and just stop relying upon oil and gas for the short term, we've got to recognize there's a new economy out there we've got to be prepared for. With solar, wind, hydropower, we've got to make sure that we have job training for a new workforce to deal with it. We've got to make sure we're not buying solar panels from China, but we're manufacturing them at home. That's essential. So I think we have to adjust to a new economy that's going to be less reliant on oil and gas in the future. We have to deal with it right now as it exists, but we have to make sure we use the infrastructure funds to help deal with the flooding that is destroying our properties, our homes, and for many people, their livelihood.
Thank you. Now we'll have 2 minutes, closing remarks.
First of all, thank you again for having me here. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry my opponent's not here. But I ask you not to take my word for his positions. We can certainly give you documentation of everything I said. And it's also in our literature, and you can certainly reach our campaign and we can give you ample documentation of it. But I want to leave you with one thought. This election is it's much bigger than Democrat or Republican. Don't buy the idea it's all just partisan politics and tune it out. This is about mainstream values versus extremism. The mainstream values that have defined my life. I reached across the aisle. I worked with members of Congress, for example, to pass the Zaroga 9/11 healthcare bill. I took on my own party to break a congressional deadline. It's about standing up for mainstream principles that unite us. That's why I stood up for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the bipartisan gun safety legislation. That's why I was a proud advocate and worked hard to make sure we passed the first time in history, legislation to lower the cost of prescription drugs, to cap the cost by using Medicare to negotiate. All of these issues my opponent differs with me on. He's opposed to all of those issues. Opposed the laws to lower the cost of prescription drugs, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and actually just opposed the gun safety legislation, amongst others. So I think working in a bipartisan way is really the answer. You've got to be able to work across the aisle to deliver locally for our districts. Not a novel idea. Our government used to work that way. But we let everything become too partisan, too divisive. So you have my commitment, and you can see the news editorial that we gave out, where they acknowledged I'm a moderate who can work in a bipartisan way, versus my opponent, they called an extremist who was not knowledgeable on the issues. So you can see that in that way, you can begin to make some progress and move forward. And quite frankly, we have to do that. The issues you're facing are the issues that define whether we're going to have a future as a country, whether we can be more inclusive and respectful, whether we can stand up to hate crimes and divisions, whether we can make sure that we have economic opportunities for everyone who comes here, so small business owners feel that they have the benefit of what the government can do, the Small Business Administration. So we make sure that education is fully funded and you have the opportunities to, because education is ultimately the pathway for success in our country. These are the issues that will define my life, issues that have inspired me, issues I talk about now that have given me my future. So I'm honored to be in front of you in your first forum. I've had a chance to work with many of you sitting in this room over the years, and I hope to have the privilege of serving for you as your member of Congress. Thank you very much.
So we actually have this room until 8:30 if you want to hang around, mingle.
And by the way, the food looks good in the back. I mean, you always have the best food.
And also, we just want to remind you, please go vote. Early voting has already started, and the closest one around here is at Michael Kelly Park during business hours, but there are multiple locations.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Hi, Robert.